Now let's get started on some tutorials. Before we begin though, I want you to know that due to tape limitations and time limitations, we are editing out a lot of rendering time in this tutorial section. If you render these images on your own, you will probably need to pause the tape in order to keep up. Okay, now that we have a basic understanding of the options within Lightwave, let's do a project. Go to the Objects area and choose Load Object. You'll want to go to Taming the Wave Disk 2. If you don't have that in your drive, put it in now. You'll find a drawer there called Block Objects. Inside that drawer are 3 objects: A, Lightwave Object, B, Lightwave Object, and C, Lightwave Object. These are children's blocks that I've built for the project. Go ahead and choose A, Lightwave Object, and load it in. Let's go ahead and take a look at what that is first of all by a quick render. I'm currently running an 040 at 28 megahertz. There are faster processors. Odds are, however, you're using a slower processor. This could take quite a lot of time in all of these projects if that is the case. It took my machine 1 minute and 13 seconds to generate this image. Of course, there's not much to this image yet, is there, because everything's white. That's because the object came in with its surface colors undefined. They're default settings. The gradient in the background is also a default setting. Let's go in and change that gradient first of all. Go to the backdrop area within Lightwave. Click on the Zenith Color button and set it to 0 red, 0 green, and 0 blue. This gives us black. Now set Zenith Color only. This means that next time we render, the backdrop will be rendered as pure black, with none of the other color gradient steps used. Now let's go ahead and adjust the surfaces. Go into the Surfaces area, and you'll find there are a number of current surface settings defined. They're all set to the same default surface. Go to letter A, faces Y. This represents the surfaces on the face of the letters on the block, which you would see if you were looking directly at it. Let's go ahead and set this to a red color, which would be 200, 0, and 0. And we want to do this for faces X as well, and faces Z also. So now all 3 of them have red faces. Let's go ahead and render that now and see what we've got. As you can see, the A is coming in red. This is because that is the surface that we defined. The rest of the block is still white because we haven't changed their surfaces yet. Now what we're trying to achieve here is a child's wooden block. This looks pretty good so far, but it looks kind of plastic. Let's change the A surface just a little bit more. Go back to Faces Y and go into the diffusion area. Okay, what we're going to do is set a texture for diffusion, and we're going to use a wood map for that diffusion. We could be using the wood map as a surface color, but then whatever color that wood map was when we imported it is the color that the face would be. We want the face to stay red, so we need to load the image, which you'll find in your wood directory that came with the toaster. Load light wood. This is a 24-bit image. It's pretty large. It uses up 750K in memory. If you have Art Department Professional, you could take this into there and reduce it to a 16 color image, and you'd probably still get a pretty good looking wood map, but it would take a lot less space. Anyway, let's go on back to surfaces, back into diffusion, and go into texture. Okay, now that we're in texture, what we're going to do is planar image map the texture, the wood map, onto the surface. So you want to say the texture image is light wood, And since we're using the faces Y surface at the moment, we want it to cast on the Y axis. Now we're going to make life real easy and say automatic sizing, so it'll automatically fit the texture onto the surface appropriately. Last, we want to turn on anti-aliasing. This will give us a higher quality surface. And finally, use texture. Now we want to do this as well for faces X, the only difference being that with faces X, we want it cast along the X axis. Automatic size, anti-aliased. And finally with Z, do the same thing, cast along Z. Let's take a look at this now. Now as you can see, the surface of the A is still red, but now it has a wood-like look to it. This is because the wood map is being used as a measurement of light and dark texture within the surface itself. Now we'll do the rest of the block. The frame itself, the ledge part of the block, is represented by block A, frame X, Y, and Z. For them, we'll use the same technique. Red 200, diffusion map matching the direction that it faces, in this case Z. Z axis, automatic size, anti-alias. Same thing for frame Y. Along the Y axis. If you're having problems keeping up, don't worry about it. That's why this is on videotape. Okay, so now we've got all of the frame settings to be the same wood, red wood, as the faces of the letters. Now we need to set the main body of the block, which is the area surrounding the letters in between the ledges. For this, we'll want to use regular wood, not painted, so that it'll give the appearance of a hand-painted block. For this, just go into Surface Color, Texture, and map it on the appropriate direction. The only difference that we've made here now is that we didn't color this red, and instead of using just the diffusion map of the wood, we're using the surface color map of the wood. We also want to add the diffusion. This will give us the proper lighting look for it when we render. And you do that the same way. Oops, set that to Y. And the other parts of the main body, do the same. And diffusion. So you're doing this 3 times, remember that. Texture, light wood, automatic sizing, anti-alias. Oh, wrong one again. That's Z. There we go. Diffusion. You don't have to do these in any particular order. The only order that matters is when you pick the texture axis, then click automatic sizing, or else it'll get different proportions. Okay, so now we've got pretty much the entire thing done. Let's take a look at this. We've only got one more piece to go, so we'll render just once more. Now you'll notice that as we're adding detail to this surface, the render time is taking longer and longer. This is because when you're using an image map, Lightwave has to slow down and calculate that a lot more carefully than just a plain surface. You can speed up Lightwave's rendering of images by reducing the number of bit planes or number of colors using a program such as AD Pro. You could shrink the size of the image. Instead of using a full screen image, shrink it down to maybe half size, you'll find that you'll usually get the same level of detail from that, and Lightwave automatically figures out what you're doing. Now, as you can see, we've added a lot more life to this block. The wood texture is looking pretty woody back there, and the red came out nice. We could use a little bit of specularity on the red, maybe, to give it more of a painted feel. Of course, if you prefer the raw wood paint look, you could stick with this. And keep in mind that everything that we're doing here on this tape, none of these are rules. You can do anything you want. These are just some ideas to get you started. Now you can see the part that we haven't textured yet. It's showing up as white. Along the base of the A, you can see it best. That's actually marked as sides. Now we'll want to adjust the sides of that letter. Start by going to Surface Color and setting it to the same red. We're going to use the same red for the siding. And Diffuse. Turn on your image texture of light wood on the x-axis for the x sides. Automatic sizing, anti-aliasing, just like we did before. There's a lot of repetition in this work, but it all pays off in the end. You may say that, why do I have to go to all this trouble with diffusion mapping? That's a simple matter of wanting to get a higher quality output. You'll find that it'll look much more realistic with diffusion and specularity mapping settings adjusted. A world of difference. I think we've got them all. Yeah, okay. So now we've got everything set. Let's change the view on our block a little bit. We'll do this by going into Layout. And as you can see, here's our block. When we first got in here, and if we move around, it turns into just a hollow box. That's Lightwave's quick way of rendering the image. When you let it go, after a second, it'll reappear. Okay, so let's go back to where we came in. On the upper left view mode, go to Camera View so that we know we're looking through the camera. Now, Edit Item, Camera, so we're going to affect where the camera is. We want to turn off X and Z so that we're only going to be able to move up and down with the camera. If we move the mouse any other direction, it'll still move only up and down. So go ahead and move the camera up a little bit. We'll put it, let's say, at 2.0. The position appears down here in the corner, so you'll know where you are. Then change to X only, and slide the mouse to the left to about negative 2.4 is good. And finally, change mouse function to rotate and point the camera at the object. You can do this from basically anywhere you want. So center it roughly in your screen and hit Create Key. You want to make sure to create the key, because if you don't, Lightwave will not remember the move that you just made. So we want to make sure that the key is created at frame 0, because that's where we are. Frame 0 never gets rendered, by the way. Animations always start at frame 1. 0 is used as a place to set up your animation. Okay, so we want to create the key at frame 0 for the item only. That means it'll be just the camera that gets a key created. All items would give us everything all at once. So selected item, OK. Now we can exit the layout and render one more time. Now we'll get a 3D view on our block with our surfaces set. Like I said before, if you wanted to make the paint job on the block better, you could mess with specularity. That would be one way. Using a specularity map of the wood itself might be interesting to get glistens. There's just no end to the textures that you can define in this manner. By the way, if at any time while Lightwave is rendering on the grayscale screen, you decide that you want it not to render anymore, you can stop it by hitting Escape. Okay, now that it's done, that took 2 minutes 42 seconds for Lightwave to render that image. And this is on an 040, remember, speed is everything. If you're using, say a 68020, this image could have taken you probably 45 minutes, at least, I would think, to render. Speed is everything. Buy the best accelerator you can afford. It'll pay off in the long run. So now that we've textured our object, let's go ahead and save it. Go to Objects Control Panel and Save Object. Make sure it's identified here. In this case, it doesn't matter because we've only got one object loaded. But when you have more than one, make sure that you're dealing with the one you think you are when you save object. And you can go ahead and save it over the original or make a copy by changing the file name here, or move it to another directory if you wish. These are all standard file requesters, and hopefully you already know how to work them. So save the object. In this case, we're overwriting, so it makes sure that we want to do that. Say yes. Your disk may be write protected. In that case, Lightwave will come back and let you know that that's the case. Go ahead and pop the disk out and unwrite protect it. Of course, if you're wise, you've already made backups of these disks and you're using your backups anyway. Okay, we've saved our object, and that's all there is to this example of texturing. There are two other objects, the B and C Lightwave objects that were in that drawer. And those are the same blocks with the appropriate letters, and the surfaces are already defined for you. So you have a red A and, let's see, green and blue are the other two. And you can use those for your own test animations, and you'll get some really nice results out of them. Let's go on to another tutorial. Alright, now that we've finished our first texturing tutorial, let's start a real project. Take a look at this animation first. This is what we're going to produce. As you can see, this is a modification of one which was used earlier in the tape. We're going to build it from scratch using all of the original pieces. First thing you want to do though is clear the scene of everything that was in your tutorial previously. So go to the Scene Control Panel and click Clear Scene. It makes sure you want to do that. Say yes, okay. Go into Objects, Load Object. On Taming the Wave Disk 2 is an X objects directory. Go in there and you'll find a list of X-related objects which we'll be using. First part we need is the X itself, so load X Lightwave object. We'll go into Layout and take a look at that. As you can see, this is just a standard X until it turns a little bit. You don't need to rotate this, I'm just showing you. There's doors cut into the sides of the X. Now at the moment there's nothing covering those up, those are empty holes, so let's load the doors and put them in position. Exit the layout and go back to Load Object, and let's start with the upper left door, Lightwave object. Say OK. We'll go into Layout. As you can see, we've got the door down here. We'll change our selected item to read upper left door using these arrows. And we can see it's not in the right place. That's because it was built around the 0 axis, rather than being built in position on the X. This allows it to rotate around itself, rather than in a larger circle, as it would if it were built there. So we need to place that manually. We can do that one of two ways. First is to use the mouse functions to move it where we need it. Another way is to type in the exact coordinates and positioning that we want. We can find that out by going into, well, actually leaving the layout, going into Modeler, and I've already preloaded the X up here. I know that we want to find the position for the upper left door hinge, so that's going to hinge right here. All we do is grab those points and hit I on the keyboard for point info. This gives us the numbers for the exact position that the door should hinge. We're not going to use it to as many decimals as are revealed here because it's in millimeters and it'll be very close. So make a note of these numbers, 373 and 755 for X and Y, and exit. So now we go back into Layout, and we've already got our object selected as the selected item. click numeric input, and we can type this in. One thing we need to keep in mind is that Lightwave is primarily operated in meters. So we aren't going to just type 373 here. That would be a tremendously large move, being 373 meters. We want to tell it millimeters, which we do by using decimal 373. Okay, and then same for the 755. So now it reads x is 0.373, y is 0.755. And we don't need to move z because that's already in position. Click OK, and our door is placed in the proper position. Now, immediately what we want to do is create a key for that, so we don't accidentally move to another frame, which would move that object back where it was. So we want to create a key at frame 0 for the selected item only. Click OK. Now that we've positioned that and created a key, I can show you what it does. Go ahead and go to mouse function rotate and turn bank on and all the others off. And now if you use the right mouse button, you can rotate that door back and forth. Okay? So that's what we managed to do there. You can get it to go back into position just by going to the next frame and coming back. That way it resets, since we didn't create the key once we rotated it. Alright, let's go get the next door now. Exit layout and load object. This time let's get the upper right door. And we already know the numbers because, like I told you, we went and checked in Modeler. And I won't go look this one up again because, like, I already know. So we want to go to mouse function move, numeric input again, and the upper right door goes at 0.902x and 0.755y. And click OK. Now it goes into position. Now, did you notice that the Y position stayed the same in both? It should be that way because this should be exactly the same on both sides. Once it's in position, go ahead and create the key, again on frame 0 for the selected item only. Okay, now we've got to get the lower left door. Back into layout. And change your selected item to lower left door, numeric input, and the lower left door goes at x 0.350 and y 0.468. Okay, so there we've got that in position. And finally, we need to get the lower right door. And do the same thing with it. Change your selected item to right door, numeric input, and this goes at x 0.923 and y 0.468. Okay, so there we've got our doors in position. Remember to create the key. At this point, when you have a number of items and you know that nothing is changing at the moment, you can create the key for all the items. Just remember, next time you go in to create a key, it'll still have all items chosen. You'll usually want to use selected item. Okay, so now we've got the doors there. Let's go ahead and set up some motion for these doors. The total animation is 120 frames. So we'll go into Scene and say last frame is 120. Go into Layout again, and we want to set these doors to open in 60 frames. So the best way to do this is to look at it straight on. See, we're seeing it with a sort of perspective. Go to the XY view mode, and you can see straight on. Now, we need to get in closer to look at it, so click Edit Item View, and mouse function Move, and then just move the object until it's in the center. Change to Zoom for mouse function, and holding the left button, move the mouse to the right. You may need to pick up the mouse and move it back, and that kind of thing. That's fine. Okay, once we're here, we don't need to create a key for a view because a view remembers where it is. So we can go back to Object, And since we started with the upper left door, let's start there again. Click mouse function rotate. And we should still be on bank. We want to use the right mouse button to rotate it until it just about lines up with where that hinge would probably stop the door. Okay, once it's there, click create key. Mine's at negative 165, by the way. You can create the key, but don't create it at frame 0. Don't just click OK. Type in 60 and hit enter. Okay, that tells it to go ahead and accept the button setting that we had here, but to put it on frame 60. So now we can go to next key, and you can see that it took us to frame 60 and the object's there. Previous key takes us back to 0 and the object's where it started. That means that over the course of 60 frames, it makes that rotation. Okay, so now we're going to do that with the other doors. Go to the upper right door, and remember this one, fully rotated, went to negative 165. So this one, fully rotated, should be about 165 because it's rotating the opposite direction. That's about right. Okay. Since we're looking at this on frame 60, make sure it says 60 here. Create the key, and you can see it says create key at frame 60. Go ahead and say OK. A new button appears when you're there, spline controls. Since the doors are opening, we kind of want it to appear that they aren't just being flung open, but that they're actually hydraulic or something to that effect. So we'll go ahead and add a tension factor to it of 1. That will cause the door to slow down as it approaches its resting place. And we did that on frame 60, the last frame of that motion. You can go ahead and go back to the upper left door and do the same thing to its spline control on frame 60. Set the tension to 1. Okay, now let's go ahead and make a quick preview of just this and see how that came out. Make preview, wireframe, and say OK. Now what Lightwave is doing is generating a wireframe preview for us to look at. It takes a moment or two to do this. Depending on the speed of your machine, it may take longer than a moment or two. But it's a pretty rapid way of getting an idea of what your scene looks like without rendering it all out. Okay, now the frame count has gone past 60. We know that's all that's defined, so just hit escape and it'll stop. Go to play preview and your VCR controls come up. You can play at 30 frames a second and see how that looks. Play it backwards. That looks pretty good. Okay, end playback. Now we want to rotate the other two doors. Cycle to the cycle to the lower left drawer and rotate again on bank. Now notice that this hinges the other way. That's because the 0 point in modeler was here on this one and there on that one. That's the center of rotation. So we want to go ahead and rotate this on bank. This will probably be a slightly different rotation simply because the angle of the X is not exactly the same. Let's see. Take it to about probably 170. Yeah, a bank of 170 for the lower left door. In frame 60. Alright, create the key, make sure it says 60, and click OK. Spline controls set to tension of 1. Now we've got to set the lower right door, and for that, since the last one was at 170, this should be negative 170. And right about there. If you don't want to do this with the mouse, you can just click numeric input and type in these numbers at any time. Okay, so we put that there. and we're still in frame 60, create the key. Selected item, frame 60. Okay, now we should have all 4 doors opening just fine. But see, they overlap. That's a problem there. The doors shouldn't overlap as they open because it wouldn't happen in reality. One of the key pieces to making an animation work, even if it's something far out like this, is to give it some element of realism to convince the person that it's a solid object. Doors don't go through each other. Okay, so what we need to do then is put a delay on 2 of the doors. We'll do that first of all. We didn't set the spline control for this one, did we? Did you remember to? Click spline control, tension to 1, and OK. Alright, so there we fixed that. Now we need to go back and take care of that delay. So we got to choose which one opens first. I think the top probably opens first. So go on down to the bottom 2, either one. Well, actually, let's start with lower left. And go previous key. Okay, now this is where it starts, remember. We want it to wait, let's say 5 frames before it starts opening. But this one won't. So it'll open and maybe swing out of the way before this would get there. So create the key at frame 5 for the selected item. Since we didn't move it, that means that at frame 5, it should be in the same place. Now notice that the object actually wobbles a little in those frames. There's an easy way to solve that. Go ahead and go to the frame 5 and set the spline control to linear. That'll keep the object in the same place. It won't wiggle at all. Okay, now you need to go to the lower right door, previous key to go to frame 0, and create the same key at frame 5. Go to frame 5 by clicking next key and set the spline control to linear again. So let's go ahead and make this preview. Looks like that'll work. Whoa, pretty tight. Okay, all in all, that looks right. We can go ahead and stop that. If you generated that preview, you can show it, play preview, like that. And that looks pretty good. Okay, let's go back to the camera view for a moment. Remember, this is all the camera's going to see, anything in this viewpoint. So go to the previous key to frame 0. Since the camera edit item is selected now, we know that there are no keys for the camera because we only set them for the objects. Okay, first thing we want to do is move the camera to an interesting angle to look at these doors opening. Let's leave the beginning frame of the animation here as it is, create the key, which should already be there, and then move the camera. You can use the mouse or type in some numbers to get over here, whichever you find easiest, but just move it over to the left side of the X and then point the camera back towards it. Alright, now create a key for this view angle for the camera at frame 60. Okay, now let's take a look at what that did for us. Make the preview. As you can see, the camera moves in the course of the animation as well as the doors. You can have an unlimited number of objects in motion, including your lights and, camera, you name it. It can all move in an animation. So here's what we've got so far. That looks pretty nice. Okay, now we need to put the bar in. So let's go get that. Exit the layout, objects, load object. Now there are 3 objects that make up the bar. There's X unstretched, X positive stretch, and X full stretched. These we want to load in that order. We want unstretched first, go back to load object, positive stretch next, load object, unstretched. Go back to load object, positive stretch next, and full stretch last. Now why do we need 3 objects here? Because we're going to morph it. Unstretched basically doesn't exist, it's just a marker in the center. Positive stretch is the bar stretched all the way out on its positive direction. Full stretch is stretched both ways across the X. Here we can see all 3 objects in the layout that are appearing as one. If we go to Object and cycle through the selected item, we can see that unstretched is very small, positive stretch goes that way, and full stretch is the whole bar. Now, since we don't want to see all of them the entire time, we need to set a dissolve envelope, first of all. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is go to X, where is it? Full stretch. And we want to hide this completely. Set the object dissolve to 100%. You can do that with the slider or just type it in here. Click OK. The reason for this is because we're going to metamorph into this object. You don't have to have metamorph objects visible. It'll still morph just fine. So it also saves rendering time, so we're going to hide it completely. And we want to do the same thing to positive stretch. Object dissolve 100%. Okay, now for unstretched, this is where we start getting into envelopes because we need to set a metamorph envelope. Click on metamorph and into envelope, and here's your envelope screen. Okay, we don't want any metamorphing to start happening until frame 60, which is when the doors are open. So create a key at frame 60. You'll see that appear over on the right hand side. Now we want the first morph from being the small bar inside to being the positive stretch to take about 20 seconds, we'll say. Create a key at frame 80. Whenever you have a requester that appears like this with a number and a cursor before it, you don't need to click in there or delete any of that. Just type in your number and hit return. Okay, so now that we've got our frames at 60 here and 80 there, we need to tell it that, first of all, there's going to be 100% value at 80. So click envelope value, and you can use the slider again or type, set it to 100%. This means that the object will be fully morphed into the next one that we specify at frame 80. As you can see, we've got a strange dip happening here as part of the spline curves. We don't want that because the object shouldn't be doing anything inside during these 60 frames. So go ahead and step back to 60 and set the spline control to attention. Oh, I'm sorry, wrong splines. Click linear. Okay, there we go. Now, you've got that effect set up. We want to keep the end behavior the same because once it morphs there, it should just stop. And use envelope. Next, we need to set the metamorph target for that object. So when it morphs, it's going to go from unstretched to positive stretch. Make sure you mark this here or it won't work. Next step in this is to go to positive stretch and set a metamorph target for it because we want positive stretch to metamorph into the full stretch. So click metamorph in positive stretch, envelope, and we want to create a key, but where do we want to put this now? We've got the other morph happening at 80. Okay, so the object we're currently modifying will be visible at frame 80. Well, the next step, we should probably have the same amount of time as we used in this first one. So we want to, first of all, create a key at frame 100. And you can create a key at 80 as well. This will help to have you keep up with where the metamorph is at any one time. At frame 80, we know that we're completely solid. At frame 100, we want to metamorph into the next object. That's 20 frames after 80, because we use 20 frames after 60 to get to this, remember? Okay, so you want to go back down to frame 80 in the current key and set it linear again. That way we get a nice clean action. Use envelope. Set the metamorph target to be full stretch, and you're all set. Now we'll go back into layout and take a look at the animation. Let's make a preview again. As you can see, the unstretch is just sitting in there. You won't be able to see that because the walls of this X are solid. Okay, doors are opening and we're about to start the morph in 10 frames. And here it goes. You can see it stretching off in the positive X direction. That's the morph happening to positive stretch. And now the morph is happening from positive stretch to full morph. Okay, we can go ahead and stop that early and play the preview, and here's what we've got. Okay, it looks pretty good. Now as you can see, the bar didn't quite go all the way off the screen. So exit that and go to Camera Edit Item, selected item camera, go to the next key, and either move the camera a little closer until you see the dotted lines going across there go all the way across the screen, or just rotate the camera until it does. So create your key again once you've moved that, and that should go all the way off the overscan of the screen, so that'll look good. Exit the layout. Okay, the next thing we need to do is to bring in the words. I've pre-built the words positive and negative. Go ahead and load object and get X positive, first of all, X positive dot word. I always use this extension with words because it reminds me that it's not so much an object as a phrase. So select positive and go into layout. Now here you can see the word positive is sitting in the middle of our X. Okay, what we need to do is go to Edit Item Object and cycle it until we have X positive as our selected item. Now go to Move and turn off all of the axes except Y. Using the right mouse button, move positive up until it's over. You can see where the bar is as you're moving, so put it just over the bar. Now click X on and turn Y off and move the mouse to the right to move the word over. Okay, now as you can see, the word doesn't quite fit here, so let's go ahead and scale that item a little. We go to mouse function stretch, and I like to use numeric input because I can control it better. Numeric input, try a value of X 0.8, Y 0.8, and leave Z alone. That tells it that we're going to take basically 80% size of the original object. So say OK, and it shrinks down. Now that should be just inside the overscan, but I'm not quite certain. Let's go ahead and take it to 0.7 and 0.7. That's better. Okay, go ahead and create the key. Now you don't want to just create it at frame 60. Create it at frame 0. It's going to be there the whole time. We just aren't going to be able to see it, because what we're going to do now is exit the layout, Objects, X positive word, and set the object dissolve, envelope. Okay, first thing we want to do is set the proper span of time for this letter to be, or this word to be flashing, which is when the positive is morphing. Create a key at frame 60, which is the place where that positive morph begins. Create a key at 80, because that's where it ends. Now, we want to have the flash happen every 5 frames. It'll alternate off and on. So, create a key at 65, a key at 70, a key at 75, and of course we already have a key at 80. Okay, go back to current keyframe 0 and set the object dissolve envelope here to 100%. That means we aren't going to see it in the first frame. Now if we left this the way it is now, we'd have a ramp. It would start out invisible and slowly dissolve in over these 60 frames. We don't want to do that. We want to have it stay out of sight until frame 60. So go to 60 and set envelope for 100%. Now we've got to set that linear again, or else it won't be a steady event. Now you see that it formed some new spline curves down here. We'll need to adjust those too. But this first step, 60 to 65, should be just like it is, going from invisible to fully visible. Set it to linear. The next step, we're going to stay there 5 frames, set it to linear. On frame 75, we're going to go back to 100% and set it to linear. Frame 80 is going to also be 100% linear. And then let's go ahead and add a couple more flashes just because we don't have it back in sight yet. So we'll create a key at 85 and a key at 90. Go back to 85 and set that to linear. That's right here. And frame 90 to linear, and that stays on. We could actually get by with just the key at 85 coming back to 0, but this is better for when you want to come back later and see what the motion is, or what the envelope does. This is much clearer. So now we've got that set. Go ahead and use envelope. And now we need to set the negative object. So load the object for X negative word, and go back into layout. We need to position negative now. See, we've got the word here. Notice that positive disappeared. That's because as far as Lightwave is concerned, it's not there yet. It hasn't arrived. If we go past frame 60 where it does appear, then it pops up. Lightwave automatically hides things that are fully dissolved. Okay, so let's get back to working with the negative. We'll go to frame 0, and actually let's go back to frame 60 for a second. Let's set this up here since we did the other one. Object, make sure that you've got it set to X negative word. Move, we're going to do this the same way. Move on Y first, and just up wherever you feel comfortable. About 0.260 on Y looks good. And move it on X. Over here we've got the same problem. We want to reduce it to be the same size as the other word. So stretch, numeric, and we used 0.7, 0.7, and 1. We're leaving the Z1 because we don't want to change the depth of the letters since they're flat anyway. So go ahead and move back over on the X, fit it back in. Oh, we're still too big. Okay, so what we need to do now is shrink it still more. Go back to stretch, numeric input. Let's try 0.5, 0.5, and 1. Okay, this gives us exactly half size as it was originally built. Now we can use Y to move that back up to the line. Remember though, we've got to create this key at frame 0 again, not 60, frame 0. And we also want to make sure that the positive word size matches this one. So get the scaling, it's 0.5, 0.5, and 1. Go back to X positive and set that to 0.5, 0.5, and 1. Okay. Now we've got the positive word. You can just see it long enough when it redraws the screen there. That's the same size. Go to frame 60 and make sure that everything still looks all right. Yes. Okay, so we're all set there. Let's go and set the envelope for negative in objects. Make sure your current object is negative, and object dissolve, envelope. Okay, now the negative bar doesn't start appearing until the second stage of the morph, which begins at frame 80. So we'll go ahead and create a key at 80. and create a key at 100, because that, again, is the beginning and end of the second morph. We want to set the frame 0 value to 100, so it's fully dissolved, it's out of sight. Frame 80 to 100, and set that linear, so it's a smooth effect. And we want to insert our keys in between here, between 80 and 100, so create a key at 85, create a key at 90, at 95, and we've got one at 100. We know we're going to need 2 more, like we did in the other one, so create a key at 105 and 110. Okay, now let's go back and set these flashes. Here's our frame 80, remember that's this one. Then we come all the way on, set to linear. Next key, frame 90, stays there, linear. 95 blinks off again by going to 100, linear. And frame 100 is still off, linear. And 105, we're coming back down here, we're on, linear, and 110 stays. So we've got that same envelope, we just basically scooted it over into these further along frames. Use the envelope and we're all set. Now let's go ahead into the layout, in the camera view, and take a look at this with a wireframe preview. And play the preview. 30 frames a second. Okay, now this is happening a little bit faster than the original animation. I'm going to leave it to you to change it however you like. You can slow it down or speed it up. You've learned all the techniques for that. So let's go ahead and work on the rest of the scene, because if we render it now, this is what we've got. That frame took 1 minute 3 seconds. This is actually frame 60 of our animation, just so that we could have an interesting view. I did that by setting the first frame to frame 60. It's that simple, folks. Let's go back to frame 1 as first frame. And what we want to do is get rid of the horizon line in the background. And rather than having just a gradient backdrop, let's bring in a stage. We'll build a set for the object. So we go to Objects, Load Object. Okay, we want to load in the set object, right here, X set. And go into Layout. Now all the set is, actually, we can use any of these view modes to look at our scene, by the way. All our set is a back wall and a floor. We don't need any of the other walls because we shouldn't see them. And the object loads in pretty much exactly where we need it, so you don't need to move anything. How about that? Just to be safe, though, go to the set object and create a key for it at frame 0. That way it won't move accidentally later. Okay, now let's mess with some lights. Exit the layout and go into the lights panel. Now first thing we want to do is change the intensity of, or the color of the lights, because light is never true white, which is Lightwave's default. So click ambient color and bring it down to just a kind of a soft yellow white. I've got mine here at 255, 240, and 220 on the red, green, and blue. That gives it just a softer tinge than harsh white. And you don't have to set them all exact, you can just more or less eyeball them. I'm going to match them here though. And say OK. And now we want to add another light. We're going to use a 3-point lighting system, which is pretty much the standard lighting technique that you would use in video. Applications in video apply very well to Lightwave because it's intended to simulate making a movie, more or less. So go ahead and set the color of each of these lights down to that soft yellow white. Again, it doesn't have to be exact. And so we've got them all set. Now we go into Layout, and we don't see any lights here. We haven't seen lights so far. Click on Edit Item, Light. And here we see a light. Let's pick one of the other view modes. Where can we see it best? From the top. Okay, we can see that this is a barn door type light that's pointing in this direction so that light would cast shadows back this way. This is good for the first light. Let's move it using the mouse function move. Just move it down into the corner somewhere here. Exact position is not important. Create a key for the light at frame 0. Now go to light number 2 and move it down to the corner right. Set target. We're going to set the target of the light to be this X. That way it'll point perfectly, we don't have to worry about it. So target object X. And create a key at 0. We can also go ahead and, for the light 1, set its target to be the X as well. Now going to light 3, we're going to use light 3 as a backlight. So we'll put it just up in the corner, set target again to be X. Now we've seen all this from the top. Let's look at it from the side. There's light 3, light 2, and light 1. They're all at the same level. Let's move them up. We'll put light 1, go ahead and lock all of them except Y, and just move that up. This is another case, position's not important, just up, give it a nice angle. Now for light 2, do the same thing, but not quite as much. And for light 3, that one's going to be very high up. And create a key up there. So now if we go to visibility and say show lights, visible items lights, there are the 3 lights. We'll go ahead and turn that off because it clutters up the screen a bit. Okay, go back to camera view, and we should pretty much be done. Let's go ahead and render a frame of this and see how our lighting looks. We'll go in at frame 60 again. Change first frame to 60 and render. Okay, there we've got the finished rendering. That took 3 minutes 31 seconds on this 040. Now, in our original animation, we have shadows and reflections being rendered as well. That's done through camera. When you go into camera mode, turn on trace shadows, and it lets you know this is going to slow you down a lot. Don't use them if you have a slow machine. That's all I can say, because it'll take you forever to render complex scenes. If you're using an 040, shadows and reflections, they're acceptable speed-wise. So go ahead and turn those on if you're using that sort of machine. Other than that, that's pretty much the animation. You could render it to your hard drive, which I recommend rather than going straight to tape if you are able to record to tape, because when you record to the hard drive, you're able to use animations within other animations later, or to touch up certain areas that you aren't happy with without having to re-render the whole set. It's very worthwhile to do that. Other than that, that's about it. Go ahead and use this tutorial as a starter. Play with it, make your own animation out of it, and experiment with things. That's the most important part of learning Lightwave, is to experiment with everything. And what I like to do when I'm practicing with a new technique is to make a minor change and then render the image, and then another minor change and then render the image. That way I can see what each and every operation is doing to what I'm working on. That's really going to teach you more than just guesstimating at things and changing a whole bunch of things at once and then rendering, because you'll never know what did it. So go ahead and get started. We've included another animation here. All of the objects you'll find on the disk. We chose not to show you how to make this animation, but rather to let you make the animation based on ours. You've learned the techniques that you'll need to use. Spline controls are used heavily in this animation. You'll find that pretty much it's not as complicated as it looks. If after viewing the tape you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please contact me. There are a number of ways to do this. You can give me a call at the studio at 310-315-1750, or you can write to me at Mock Universe at 3019 Pico Boulevard, Santa Monica, California, 90405.